Hi, I'm Jennifer Mackenzie, professional home economist and cookbook author. We are cooking up an apple, onion, and sage chutney. Now, this is going to be your favorite new accompaniment to your turkey dinner or really for anything. It's a great condiment. And we're, of course, using Ontario apples. And this is a Macintosh apple. And I like to use a combination of apples in this chutney. And it's really like a savory applesauce with sort of a little extra seasoning. And the Macintoshes, of course, are nice and tart, and they soften up really nice as a sauce. And then I've got some Cortland apples as well. So I used a combination in this recipe. You can use any of the cooking apples, really. Ontario grows 15 varieties of apples, so we have lots to choose from. You do want a tartar cooking apple that holds its flavor when it's cooked, rather than one of the sweet apples that are better for eating out of hand or for salad. So choose a cooking apple that has lots of flavor and tartness, and that's perfect. It can soften, it can stay firm. It'll just depend on what you prefer for the texture. So I do peel them for this chutney, because once you're simmering chutney, it does get a little bit tough if you leave the skins on. When I eat them, I love the extra fiber from the skins, and I eat apples every day, and it really is delicious with the skin on. But for this one, you do want to peel them. One of the things you can do is take the nice red half of a Macintosh apple, pop that in just as a big chunk, and the apple part will soften, and then the red from the skins will sort of give it a nice rosy hue to your chutney. Then just before you're going to jar it up, then take out that big piece of skin, and you don't have to, worry about it being tough. It'll just be a really nice hue that it lends to the chutney. Otherwise, it'll be a lovely sort of creamy color, which is fine too. So I've got 7 cups of apple total. So when I'm doing preserving, I do use like to measure the cup 1 by 1 rather than use a big measuring cup, because it's not as accurate. So, and even if there's a little bit left over, don't be tempted to add that in, because the measurements are actually important for canning. And I've got 1 cup of onion here. In the pot already, I just have some granulated sugar and adding the apples. And the only actual sort of specialty ingredient that you need for canning is pickling salt. So this pickling salt is a little bit coarser, and there's no additives in it. So there's no iodine and there's no anti-caking agents. So that gives you a much purer flavor for pickles, chutney, etc. And it's a little bit coarser. So if you are using a kosher salt with no iodine, you could use that as well, but just use a little bit less. This just uses about 2 teaspoons. And there we go. And some cider vinegar. So it's really, really simple. And some fresh black pepper. And that makes it a little more savory. You don't have to put the pepper in, and it certainly doesn't make it too spicy, but I do like to add some, and definitely the fresh, and that adds just sort of a little layer. If you wanted to heat it up a bit, you could add some hot pepper flakes. You could simmer in a little bit of hot pepper. If you want to take it more on the sort of savory herb side or the savory spice side, you could add some cumin, some cinnamon, and stir that up and bring it to a boil. So that's all it takes to get your chutney going. So start it on medium heat. Now this recipe is from the Complete Book of Pickling, 2nd edition, which is my cookbook with 250 pickles and chutneys and things. And there's lots of canning information in there. So if you've never done canning before, it is good to read a reliable source before you get started. A few techniques, really, it's not that difficult, but you do just, have to be a little bit more careful. So you need some special equipment. The jars are your very standard mason jars with the 2-piece lids. So do be sure you always use a new lid disc. And you can reuse the rings as long as they're not rusty or bent. And sterilize your jars. I use the dishwasher. Put it on a sanitize cycle. I've got some heating up in here because you always want to heat your jars first. And this is my canner. So if you don't have a canner, you can use a big pot. Just put a rack or a towel in the bottom. The big thing is you don't want the jars jiggling on the bottom and potentially cracking. So do put something in the bottom to cushion the jars. And if you are going to be doing a lot of canning, this big pot is very convenient because you can fill it with water, and it's made to sort of hold a lot of jars. and it really is handy, and it comes with a built-in rack. So it is worth, and they're very small investment actually if you are doing a lot of canning. So one of the things when you're bringing your chutneys or pickles or anything with sugar in it to a boil, bring it to a boil over medium heat so it gives a chance for the sugar to dissolve. So if you bring it to a boil too high, this sugar can stay granular, and then that's not a very pleasant texture in your final product. So bring it to a boil slowly and let that simmer. While that's boiling, get your canner ready. It does take sort of half an hour, 45 minutes to come up to a boil, so plan accordingly and get that going. One of the other things I find is great about canning in season is you get to take advantage of all the good prices. You get to support your farmers, and then you can enjoy it all year long. January, when there's not a lot of fresh, I mean, we get fresh apples almost all year, but there's a lot of things that aren't as convenient. So it's nothing like popping open that jar of the taste of summer in the doldrums of winter. And one of the other things I love about canning is you can package up a whole bunch of jars and give it as gifts. So people love to have something homemade. And one of the other things is this year, maybe we're not going to be traveling as much for gatherings. We're not going to have the big holiday dinners, but you could have a little jar of the chutney and give that to everybody that you might normally be visiting with. And then they can have a little taste from your kitchen in their Thanksgiving dinner. So this is going to come to a boil. I'm just going to clear off my cutting board a little bit. That's the one thing you do want to keep your workspace tidy. And I'm putting a towel down. And this is some chopped fresh sage. So once it's boiled, so I've got one here. I'm going to switch it out. And I've got one that's finished that I boiled earlier. And as you can see, you want to boil it until it sort of mounds on a spoon. So you can see that it's nice and thick. It's got that sort of creamy color hue, and it's nice and thick. Now, don't make it too thick because it'll thicken quite a bit on cooling as well. So warm that up, and then get your jars ready out of the canner, and we'll be ready to fill them. So you want the hot jars. That one wasn't hot, so I won't use it. And you want hot jars and hot food going into them, and that just prevents any cracking. And I filled these with water. I've got one big one because we're going to want to open a big jar at our house and have that on the go. And dump out the water. And here's one smaller jar, and that one is ready. I'm going to pop another one onto the canner to keep hot while I do this. And fill your jars. So really it's not a lot of work, just the preparation, keeping the jars hot, and stir in the sage just before you're about to put it in the canner, and that keeps it nice and fresh. The flavor will infuse. If you don't care for sage, you could use thyme, you could use basil even, a touch of rosemary. If you don't have your own fresh herbs from the garden, like I do, you can certainly buy them. Our farmers grow those too. And often you get nice big bouquets at the farmer's market. So if you love going to the farmer's market, this is the great way to sort of support your local farmers that have been working hard all year and growing our food. And we want to thank them, and thanking them is buying from them is a good way to thank them. So I'm taking my chutney now, and it's nice and fluid, so it just drops down into the jar. Fill that up. Now, the other key is to make sure there's no bubbles. So you can check with a bubble remover like this. Make sure there's no bubbles. And you also want to make sure you've got the right amount of headspace. So the headspace in your canning jar is the space between the top of the fluid and the rim of the jar. So this one, I'm going to put that down a little bit. I want about half an inch, and that's about 3/4 of an inch. So I'm just going to add a tiny bit more chutney. And the reason your headspace is so important is you want to create a vacuum when you are sealing your jar. And that takes all the air out of the jar, and it actually is what preserves it. So it's a vacuum seal. And if you have too much headspace, you actually don't get a good vacuum. If you have not enough headspace, the chutney can squirt out the edge. So when it's in the canner. So we don't want to do that. So look at that one's probably a bit too full. Oh no, it might be just perfect. I've done this a few times. And so pat that down and measure. So if you don't have one of these, you can use a ruler, of course, but this is a bubble remover and Headspace measure, very handy tool. And then you want to wipe the rim. So I'm going to just dip it in a bit of the hot water that I used to warm up my lids. Wipe that rim because you don't want any food on the edge, because that'll prevent a good seal. So here's my little saucepan of my warm lids, and this is called a magic wand. It's actually just a stick with a magnet on it, but it is a very, very handy tool. Picks up your lid out of there. You don't have to touch it, keeps it sanitary. And all my equipment was sterilized and sanitary before I started. And that is also definitely, you don't want any mold or anything, because if you've worked all that, magic of cooking it up and chopping it up, you definitely don't want to introduce any other microorganisms. So that's really one of the keys of canning: sanitary and using a tested recipe. Maybe a recipe that was, an old family recipe that from 50 years ago that maybe hasn't, been updated, isn't such a great idea. We know a lot more now about science, and we love to follow food science for the most safety. So turn those lids. See, as you notice, I just turn them till they're fingertip tight. Do not crank them, because that can cause too much pressure in your jar. So my canner is hot, as you can see. I've got my other jar here. It's nice and hot now, so I can fill that one as well. And then as these are filled, I put them on the rack, because you want to keep them hot. You don't want to let them sit out and cool while you fill the other jars. So I do a couple at a time. If you're really fast, you can take them all out at once, but I do find it better just to do them gradually. So I'll do one more jar. And as I said, you can make up the small jars or the big jars, depending. You want to be able to eat it sort of within a month or so once it's open. You can even use the little 125 ml jars and give those as little gifts. Those are a nice little gift for people maybe that live alone, or just a house of two. And so there is our apple, sage, and onion chutney, all Ontario. And of course, we know apples are nutritious, and we know they're delicious. And this is going to make a super accompaniment for our turkey. It makes a great sandwich spread, and for all those wonderful Ontario cheeses and crackers. And oh, I didn't wipe the rim. Wipe the rim. And that is your chutney. Pop those into the canner, bring it back to a boil, and then start the timing. And then you boil them for 10 minutes, and that is it. So once they're done, let them cool. Don't ever tip your jars. So lift them straight up and straight down. Don't ever tip them. Let them cool for 24 hours and you are set. So there's our wonderful chutney in the canner. And like I said, if you don't want to can it, you can actually just pop it in the fridge and store it there. Do use a sterilized jar, because it will actually keep a lot longer than if you just use a plastic container or something. So it is handy to do that. And go out and find your Ontario apples. And we want to see what you're cooking at home and how you're supporting our farmers. Thank you.